Hey guys, so this is Mr. O'Brien, and what we're going to talk about today is the first topic of the Keystone exam. So the Keystone exams is, it's coming up, and this video is kind of going to help you work your way through it with 8 simple topics. So this is topic 1, and we're talking about the themes of life. So let's talk about the 8 themes of life that we have. Now the first one we have is living things are made up of cells. So all living things are composed of these things called cells. And what cells are is they are the smallest unit of structure and function. So the cell pretty much, like as we see over here, this is a plant cell, okay? So each one of these cells is a living thing, okay? Or it makes up a living thing, I guess I can say. Now, cells can either be unicellular, which means they are composed of one cell, or multicellular, they're made of many cells, okay? So a cell, like I said, we have prokaryotic, which means they have no nucleus, and we have eukaryotic, which means they are nucleus, more complex, and they have organelles. Okay, so again, living things are made of cells. Now the second characteristic of life is that living things reproduce. Now there's 2 different ways to reproduce. There's asexually, which just pretty much means we are making an exact copy. So it's the formation of a new organism and from one parent. Now, here's the thing. Asexual reproduction, okay, you are making an exact copy, okay? Exact copy of your DNA. So again, asexual reproduction shows very little genetic variation compared to sexual reproduction. Now, sexual reproduction, okay, you have pretty much you're getting 2 cells from different parents, okay? And what this does is it creates a large amount of genetic variation. So this large amount of genetic variation allows our population to vary, okay? So if you look down at the picture here, there's a couple different types. We have just binary fission, where we're splitting in 2. We could also do what Hydra do, which is budding, and sweet potatoes, they kind of just, they make just an exact copy. It's more of a clone. Now, in sexual reproduction, we have sperm and egg coming together to form our little baby right here. So, again, sexual reproduction has a lot of variation. Asexual, very simple. So our second characteristic of life, living things reproduce. Now, our third characteristics of life is that living things are based, I forgot a number here, third. Living things are based on a universal genetic code. In other words, living things are made up of DNA. So DNA is pretty much the basis for all living things, pretty much every single one of them. Okay, so this is kind of remarkable to say everything is made up the same 4 nucleotides. Now, DNA is what we refer to as a double helix pattern, okay? Now, what this means is that we are arranged in what's known as a spiral staircase with 2 different combinations, okay? And it twists and turns on the way up. Double helix, 2 strands, twisting on the way up. Now, our DNA is composed of 3 different nucleotides. We have adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. A lot of times you'll just see this as A, T, G, and C. Okay? Now, these nucleotides, as they're called, okay, they're connected with covalent bonds. Now, the backbone is connected together by what are known as hydrogen bonds. Okay, so hydrogen in the middle, covalent on the ends, again, and they bind together. And the binding pattern that we will most likely see is A always binds with T, C always bonds with G. Now, our fourth characteristic of life, living things grow and develop. So when we refer to something as growing, we're just pretty much saying increasing in size. All right? And when we develop, what we're talking about is our progression through life. So our two examples of kind of what we're looking at here is our plant over here. As you can see, it gets bigger, 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 and that is what we call growth, something going from this big and getting much bigger. Now, development is like what we see in our frog cycle here. Now, our frog cycle starts with our eggs, okay, and we develop into a tadpole with 2 legs, tadpole with 4 legs, a froglet, and then an adult frog, and that is how our organisms develop through. Now, you also see this in caterpillars, egg, caterpillar, chrysalises, which is what turns into a butterfly. Growth, increasing in size, development, progression through life. Again, living things grow and develop over time. Now, our fifth characteristic of life is living things obtain materials and use energy. So every living thing needs to get energy from somewhere. Now, there's 2 forms of how we can get energy. Okay, the first one is the autotrophs, and they obtain energy from the sun. Okay, so obtain energy from the sun. Okay, and these are things like plants. Okay, so our trees, okay, they get their energy from this sunlight coming in, striking to it, and performing a process called photosynthesis. Okay, so our trees take in that solar energy and convert that into sugar. Now, heterotrophs need to eat things, so they obtain energy from consuming other organisms. By consuming, and that also means eating. So I guess the example I can give you here would be like a fish. So a fish, let's see if I can draw a fish here. Oh boy, this could get ugly. So a fish, okay? Oh man, that's very bad. So a fish, in other words, they have to eat other things. They eat bugs, they eat other insects, they eat other fish in order to get their energy. So they need to eat to get their food, like Mr. Goat up here. So our goat, he's eating the grass, as you can see right there. That ultimately came from the sun. So again, our ultimate source of energy is always sun. 6th one, we have living things respond to the environment. So what this pretty much means is, as you can see here, you look at what direction the plants are going to grow towards the light. So they're going to shift, they're going to move as we see it. Or if you see here, when you touch a hot pan, your first instinct automatically is to release it because it is hot. So a couple examples that we see, right? When you find, shelter from the rain. Okay, you are responding to your environment. You're feeling the rain, you're going inside. Also, another more animal-centered is hibernation. So when it's cold outside, there's not much food. Bears, they like to hibernate, they like to go in and kind of eliminate themselves from the elements. So again, living things respond to their environment. Now, number 7 is living things maintain a stable internal environment. So this is something called homeostasis. And this is keeping internal conditions stable relative to the external environment. So keeping internal conditions stable. So I often like to think of this as humans, they sweat, and they also shiver. So these two things are responses to our environment. We sweat when it is extremely hot out, okay? And what we do is we sweat, that water gets onto our skin, and when the breeze comes by, it cools us off naturally. Now, shivering is our muscles vibrating pretty much. And what we're trying to do is create heat inside of our body. And we do this to maintain homeostasis, maintain internal body conditions. So number 8, living things change over time. And we'll talk about this a little bit later in some topics later on in this series. But what evolution just means is change over time, okay? So in other words, species change, okay? So, species don't look the same today as they did millions of years ago. So our example that you always see is the horse here, okay? As you can see, the horse started small, and as it progressed through evolution, it changed ever so slightly, okay? Those slight changes created what the animal is today, okay? Now, a lot of time evolution is caused by mutations, and mutations are just a change in your DNA, okay? And mutations are what the driving factor of evolution is. So those are your 8 characteristics of life that pretty much lead, every living thing must contain all 8 of those living things. Again, cellular organization, reproduction, metabolism, homeostasis, heredity, response to stimuli, growth and development, and adaptation through evolution or change over time. So these 8, again, worded a little bit differently, but again, they mean all the same thing. These characteristics of life must be present in all living things. So next thing I want to talk about is something called structure and function. So in other words, each major group of organisms has evolved its own particular body part. We like to call these their toolkit, or a collection of structures that have evolved in ways that make particular functions possible. So species have adapted to life in different ways. Now we look at these 2 organisms we see here. We have a carnivore, and a carnivore eats meat. And we notice that carnivores have these very sharp canine structures. And these canines, these pointed teeth, used for piercing, gripping, and tearing, okay? And really, they're used to rip meat off the bone. Now, on the other side, we have herbivores. Now, herbivores eat plants, okay? So their teeth, as you look down here, I'll circle them in green, are more of a shearing or like kind of grinding, If you look here, our molars for the meat eaters, okay, the edges of their teeth are used to slice, where these pointers are used to kind of rip off. Now, in plant eaters, they're more of just kind of cutting, like a pair of nail clippers. And then if you look in the back, they're more for grinding. So in other words, organisms change depending on what conditions they live in. If they have evolved to eat meat, their body features are going to show that. So let's talk about the different levels of organization. So the first level of organization we have is an atom. And this is, let's go right here, the smallest unit of an element that still maintains the property of the element. So for example, like carbon or hydrogen, okay? Those are atoms that we see in the natural environment. Now, as we go down, again, we are going from smallest up here, and as we work down, we're going to work our way to the largest organization of life. So it goes atoms, molecule. Molecules are atoms that are combined together, so this would be like H2O, which you guys know as water. Again, a combination of those. Okay, then we go to the cellular level, or cells. Okay, cells, again, the smallest unit of life that is possible. Okay, so like plant or animal cells. Then we go to tissues, and tissues are a collection or a group of cells with similar functions. So like muscle cells, heart cells, all are examples that we may see. Okay, from the tissue we go to organ, such as the heart, such as the liver, such as the lungs, and the organ is two or more types of tissues that work together to complete a task. Okay, then we are going to go to an organ system. So this would be like your digestive system. And your digestive system, okay, starts with the esophagus and the mouth as it works down into the stomach, then it goes to the intestines. So it's multiple different parts working together at the same time. And then finally we have an organism, and an organism is several organs, systems working together that function as one. So an example would be our humans. And you can kind of see this up here. Cells go to tissues, collection, to organs, to organ system, to organism in general, in both animals and plants. So now we got to talk about chemistry of water. Now the chemistry of water is very important. Water is a very important molecule when it comes to science. Now water is a polar molecule, and what that means is that it both has positive and negative charges. So if we look at our water molecule, or let's even draw a water molecule here, okay? Water molecule is composed of two parts, okay? Kind of looks like a Mickey Mouse here. It's composed of oxygen, which contains a slight negative charge, and then hydrogens, which have a slight positive charge, okay? Now, what this does is it creates a whole bunch of things, but again, water is a polar molecule, which means it has a charge. Now, oxygen has both negative, oxygen is negative and is attracted to the hydrogen, which is positive. So it means it joins together very easily and forms these things called hydrogen bonds. Now, this is when the hydrogen is partially attracted to the oxygen, okay, using a hydrogen, partial positive to the partial negative. So water sticks to other things is what we're talking about. Now, when water sticks to water, water sticks to water, okay, we refer to that as cohesion, okay? And then when water sticks to something else, we call that adhesion, okay? So if we look down here, cohesion is the two water molecules sticking together. They're joining together. This happens a lot, in rivers and streams. Adhesion is when they're sticking to something else. Okay, so cohesion, adhesion. Okay, now water also has these very cool features that allow it to support life, and specific heat is one thing, and what specific heat means is that because water has a high specific heat, it holds heat very well, and it also takes a long time to release heat. So for example, the ocean may be, I don't know, let's just say like 50 degrees, okay, in this location here, okay? Even though it's very cold, it's being, let's just say the land is very hot, so it doesn't just absorb all the heat very quickly. It takes a long time to absorb it, a long time to release it, so it kind of keeps it a constant temperature. And more importantly is that water is less dense when frozen. So what this means is that ice floats. So why that's important is when ice floats, especially at the top of like a pond or something like that, it insulates the water below it. So it insulates the organisms, and also the ice doesn't form and sink to the bottom and crush all the organisms. So it allows life to be supported, especially in ponds during the winter time, and it keeps those animals warm during the winter because it insulates them. So let's talk about the scientific method now. And the scientific method is pretty much this process of how we go about questioning the real world. So the scientific method has 5 steps. And the first step you do is you've got to observe and ask a question. So I have this example over here. So I have 2 locations, location A and location B. So why is the grass growing bigger in location B than it is in location A? Okay, so there's the question I got to ask. Next thing I got to do is I got to create or infer and create a hypothesis. So what an inference is. An inference is a process of drawing conclusions from things you already know. So in other words, I look at the grass and I say, okay, location B must have more nutrients there. That's why it's growing bigger. Okay? So then you go about making a hypothesis, which is an educated, and here's the key, testable an educated, testable guess. Okay, so it must be testable because that's what your experiment is going to be based on. So maybe you say, I believe the grass in location B is growing bigger because it has more nitrogen than location A. So again, you're observing, making a hypothesis. Okay. Next, you're going to design a controlled experiment. So when you design a controlled experiment, you have to make a couple groups. Your control group is the group has no treatment. Okay? So it's just having the baseline. So you're just using normal dirt and not putting anything in there. Now the experimental group is the one that's exposed to the variable. Okay? So because it's exposed to the variable, it's the only one that's exposed to the variable, you know exactly what you're testing. Now, between these two groups, the only thing that is different is that variable. So in this case, it would be the nitrogen. We add nitrogen to this one and leave no nitrogen over here to see if the nitrogen has any effect. So in your experiment, you're going to have an independent and dependent variable. So the independent variable is the variable that the scientist manipulates. Okay? And the dependent variable is pretty much what you are measuring as a result of adding that independent variable. So for example, in this, I added nitrogen. Nitrogen would be my independent variable. So then my dependent variable, the thing you are measuring, would be the grass height. Okay? So again, usually something you are measuring for dependent variable. Now finally, you take that data and you collect and analyze it. So for example, here in my experimental group, I measure how tall the grass got. In my control group, I measure how, and I compare it. I look. Maybe I make a chart, or maybe I make a graph to determine which one is bigger, okay? So you're collecting, you're analyzing that data, okay? And then finally, you're going to draw conclusions by looking at that graph. So in this case, you're seeing that the nitrogen over many weeks, it increased more rapidly than the control group, okay? So final thing we want to talk about are theories and our hypothesis. So a theory applies to a well-tested explanation, okay? Whereas a hypothesis is just a set of observations that are tested. Theories are much more well-accepted answers, okay? They're much more well-tested. So for example, there's multiple chances where people made hypotheses and they were proven. So a theory is proven hypothesis over and over again, whereas hypothesis, you're not quite sure and it's still an educated guess. So this is your topic 1 review for the Keystone testing. Hopefully this helps you out. This is Mr. O'Brien signing off.